There'll be a second annual and a third annual and so forth. But day three of the symposium, Napoleon and his legacy, warfare, politics, and society. Today we have three excellent papers by three great scholars, although we're still waiting for Dr. Morgan to join us. So right now we're down to two great scholars, but hopefully he'll join us very quickly. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each speaker one at a time, but for the sake of time, I'm going to post their credentials in the chat room so that we can get right to it and have more time for question and answer, as it seems that we're running out of time to get everyone's questions in. So here we are, session 4, The French Way of War. And our first speaker is Jonathan Abel of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. And he is going to present a paper called The Role of Powerful Individuals in Mid-18th Century French Army Reform. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Mike. Cue my slide up here. All right, so my paper is titled The Role of Powerful Individuals in Mid-18th Century French Army Reform. It's a bit of a misnomer because we're talking about lots of powerful individuals, but really the person we're talking about who's the most important is the one on the slide, which is the Duke de Beliel, as we'll see in the paper. So what I'm doing is I'm combining two historiographical approaches here. We have lots of institutional histories, including the recently published excellent study on the École Royale Militaire by Guizard. We have lots of biographies, although not nearly as many as we should have, on people like Choiseul and Beliel, as well as my own on Guibert. But what I'm doing here is I'm marrying these two approaches. And the argument that I'm making is that these individuals, the Secretaries of State for War, they exerted significant control over the direction of military change within the War Department. And in particular, we see a shift in their background. So up to Beliel, they're rogue nobles, they're bureaucrats with ministerial experience. And then from Beliel on, they become army commanders. And I believe that that contributed to the difficulty of reforming the army after the 7 Years' War. And it's kind of an accident that Beliel dies when he does, but he dies more or less at the end of the years of combat in the 7 Years' War for the French. The war minister of the old regime was the leading magistrate of the kingdom, one of the 5 secretaries of state who attended the king and collectively oversaw much of the royal bureaucracy. The Secretary of State for War was responsible for the administration and maintenance of the army and for its performance in wartime, a duty that he shared with field commanders who were not considered to be under his direct authority. Because of this dual structure, the Secretary of State for War's influence was strongest in peacetime when most senior officers did not perform official army duties. 12 Secretaries of State for War served in the position between 1718 and the breakdown of government in 1787. Along with many in the military and society, they recognized the need to reform the French army, first to shake off the dust of the long peace after 1713, and then to meet the challenge of mid-century warfare. Thus, as might be imagined, they exerted a paramount influence over efforts to change the army. In the early half of the century, the Secretaries of State for War were drawn from the magistracy and thus the nobles of the robe, following the example set by previous Bourbon kings dating back to the early 17th century. These men were expected to have ascended through the ranks of the bureaucracy, particularly in and around Paris. Often they served in the Parlement of Paris and as intendant, first of a province and then often of Paris itself. This was true of the first 5 Secretaries of State for War, who served from 1718 to 1758. And you will notice there are some repeat offenders on this list. 2 of them served 2 non-consecutive terms. The reason I'm also picking 1718 is prior to that was the period of the Polysinody when there were technically no ministers. So Leblanc, Breteuil, Ingervilliers, Argenson, and Palmy all were the scions of rogue families, some of them dating back to the early 17th century, but most not before that. All had served as maître de requête and as an intendant, and most had served in a parlement. Few of them had direct experience with the military. None had held a command position, although Ingervilliers had been an army intendant and Palmy spent more than 5 years being groomed to inherit the office by touring the country and learning its military institutions, as we'll see. After Palmy, a significant change occurs. The central figure in this shift is Beliel, who represented the tradition to a new model of leadership for the War Department. His background was one of the most infamous in France. He was Fouquet's grandson. Fouquet, of course, is the disgraced minister and erstwhile rival to Louis XIV. He narrowly escaped execution, ended up imprisoned. His sons lived in fear of the king, Louis XIV. But Beliel and his brother, the Chevalier de Beliel, went into the army. So they kind of eschewed the magistracy of their family and went into the army instead. Beliel was driven by an intense desire to reform his family name, which revealed itself in an insatiable appetite for work, a sentiment noted by contemporary commentators. Barbier found him to be, quote, of evident spirit and a man who works like a devil. Argenson, the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, noted that, quote, he eats little, sleeps little, and thinks much, rare qualities in France. Croix, future marshal, who was basically Beliel's protege, said, quote, as his taste was always carried to great affairs, he was in its center, being minister, army general, negotiator, and counselor for the affairs of the time. He did not have a moment to himself, and in making glory. And Saint-Simon described him, quote, as always seeking to learn everything and from everyone. Beliel succinctly elaborated his own personality and work ethic in a letter to Contadis, quote, I tell you again, sir, I cannot put up with the custom of seeing men expect favors, promotions, rewards, and indulgences while they are not ready to do everything. This drive bore fruit, and it gained him elevations to lieutenant general in the interwar years, governorship of the Trois-Évêches, the marshal's baton in 1741, and the title of Duc et Père. It also allowed him to exert an enormous influence over the French government, particularly its military policy between 1720 and his death in 1761. His self-appointed mission was, quote, to recover the superiority that the king's army ought always to have held. In this period of relative peace between the death of Louis XIV and the War of Polish Succession in 1733, Beliel became one of the most important figures in the French army. Saint-Simon argues that Leblanc was a puppet for Beliel's ambitions and projects as early as 1721, which actually led to their mutual exile on Leblanc's first fall in 1723. In addition to court intrigues, Beliel also busied himself with the quotidian operations of the army. Field commanders traditionally did not have many duties during peacetime, generally attending to court and family issues and only taking up their martial roles when war loomed. Beliel, however, driven by both ambition and a desire to improve the French army, was determined to change that. He dedicated himself to learning every aspect of the military métier. Recorded Saint-Simon, quote, everywhere he served, he applied himself to knowing what was best in each military subject. Troops, partisans, general officers, artillery, génie, including supply, depots, and munitions, to paying court to the best of each kind and to following them in order to make himself like and be instructed in them. This much educated him, made him known to all the troops, and gave him a reputation. This marked Beliel out from among his peers, who rarely spent time with the army when it was not on campaign, and expected to only attend to military duties for no more than 3 months out of the year. In adopting this course of study, Beliel helped to provide a model of a modern professional officer for his peers, albeit in the service to his own ambition. According to Barbier, he was a candidate for Secretary of State for War as early as 1742, but he faced opposition at court, especially from the upper nobility who resented his lineage. In addition to developing his own skills, Beliel also helped inaugurate the great age of peacetime training camps, which stretched from the late 1720s until the 7 Years' War. This process began in 1727, when Beliel was instrumental in holding the first large-scale peacetime training camp since the 1680s. 4 camps were held across northeastern France in the late summer, each hosting a force of at least 15 infantry battalions and 20 cavalry squadrons, along with other units like dragoons and gendarmerie in some camps. More than half of the army participated in the exercises. Each was commanded by a senior commander, assisted by general officers and staff. Beliel commanded 2 of them personally. The camps had 2 functions: to test the abilities of the French army and to determine if the theories of Bombelle were functional. Beliel found that the troops were good at parading but poor at the types of maneuvers they would need to undertake in battle, especially in the ensemble. The 1727 camps established a precedent for peacetime exercises and for their conduct. Over the next 2 decades, numerous other camps would be held, especially in the early 1750s. They continued the tradition of the 1727 camps, being designed to both train troops and officers in large-scale maneuvers and to test new theories and doctrine. After the 1732 exercises, Beliel wrote to Secretary of State for War Ungerville, quote, "The more I see the troops assembled, the more I sense how it is necessary to camp every year to draw from it the fruit and the utility of the king's good service." Beliel was the center of these exercises, often commanding at camp himself, and later touring the camps as inspector of what occurred there. His role was especially apparent and important in the camps held after 1750. In addition to being exercises of the army, they were designed to implement the sweeping doctrinal changes decreed by Ancien beginning in that year. And he tasked the marshal with, quote, "reducing them," the exercises then in use, "to one that will be invariably observed without any future change," creating doctrine. Finally, Beliel became mentor to Palmy, escorting him to the various camps held during the period as a way to prepare him for his assumption of his uncle's office, which was expected to pass to him as a survivance. Beliel's role in the camps of the 1750s transcended the traditional role of a peacetime commander and ultimately served 2 purposes. It created a prototypical and even eventually aborted system of pairing a reforming Secretary of State for War like Ancien with a knowledgeable and skilled field commander like Beliel. It also elevated him from his peers in the marshalate like Richelieu to being the most prominent individual in the army, at least when it came to questions of organization, doctrine, and reform. Ironically, this elevation would destroy the nascent system developed between he and Ancien and replace it with one that was monolithic, to the French army's detriment. The relationship between Ancien and Beliel was not one of friendship, but rather one of antipathy and opposition at court. However, the 2 men worked well together, with Beliel implementing much of Ancien's reform program in these camps, testing its efficacy and reporting back to the minister. This could perhaps have evolved in the kind of relationship between the general staff officers and field commanders that has been much commented on in the Prusso-German system. A skilled magistrate and bureaucrat could craft reforms to improve the French army's performance and render it more professional, as well as cultivate the patronage required to ensure their implementation, while a field commander of Beliel's energy and coup d'oeil could offer practical tests and critiques of these reforms to further refine them. Such a system would have been valuable to an army seeking to modernize itself, especially in the tumultuous decades that follow. Palmy's apprenticeship appeared to be the ideal continuation of the system. None of Louis XV's Secretaries of State for War prior to Palmy had direct command experience, and few had much context for the army at all beyond having served in the upper levels of its bureaucracy. However, Ancien clearly recognized the need to educate his nephew and heir in the various aspects of the army and its functions. The similarity to Beliel is difficult to ignore, and Palmy's apprenticeship at the former's hands closely resembles the marshal's autodidactic course in prior decades. No longer by the mid-1750s could a Secretary of State for War simply be expected to be a good bureaucrat. He had to have the technical and particular knowledge of his bureau in order to properly administer it. This reflected the wider move towards professionalization across states and organizations of the military enlightenment, as has been noted in works on the subject. By the end of the process, Palmy was perhaps the best qualified war minister in the history of early modern France. He had significant, if venal, experience in both the bureaucracy and in the quotidian administration of the army, if not in combat itself. He also had a valuable mentor, albeit not a friend or ally, in Beliel. A new paradigm prepared to manifest in the upper levels of the French army. However, the system did not last the upheavals of the 1750s. The Damien affair and the war pressures occasioned Louis XV to dispense with most of the ministers, including Ancien. This brought Palmy to an office for which he was likely not prepared, despite best efforts. He did not secure a purchase at court, particularly with Pompadour. The war was going against France, and so he was dismissed in favor of Beliel, who held the position until his death. Beliel's accession to the war ministry marked the most significant shift in the Bureau's leadership between the rise of the Bourbon and the Revolution. Prior to his term of office, war ministers were selected from the magistracy for their bureaucratic skills and connections. With Beliel, they began to be drawn for the army itself. They also shifted from the robe nobility to the sword nobility. According to Barbier, quote, "It is said on this subject that in naming Marshal Beliel, the system of the court is to exclude people of the robe from the position of Secretary of State for War. As Julian Swan points out, the latter point was a part of the larger trend in the later half of the century, as more upper nobles like Choiseul and Castries were enfranchised at the expense of robe families like the Argansons. Instead of producing a hybrid partnership of bureaucrat and commander as Arganson's ministry was, the War Department could now be run solely by a military man. During the latter half of the century, the background of war ministers markedly changed. Beginning with Beliel, they came not from the magistracy, but rather from the army. Most were also upper nobles, including several dukes and a prince. Each of the men who served after, Gill, Monteillard, Moy, Saint-Germain, Montbarry, and Segure, had extensive military experience, most not just as parvenu purchasers of commissions, but often as frontline commanders. They had served in the army up until their time in the ministry. Beliel, of course, was the hero of the mid-century military, having participated in every war from the Spanish succession through the Austrian succession, including the epic Prague campaign of 1742. Montagnard, Montbarry, Saint-Germain, and Segure were all commended for their bravery, and both Montagnard and Segure were seriously wounded while leading troops in battle. Unlike their predecessors, most were from families established in the upper nobility. Most notably, Choiseul's family counts 5 marshals of France. Only Montagnard and Beliel were throwbacks, descended from robe magistrate families. This transition had significant effects for the army. It spent most of the period between 1762 and 1789 in a furious effort to reform itself, modernizing and professionalizing while trying to restore its efficacy and ability to win wars. This required a deft hand, both within the ministry and at court, and to guide it, especially given the upheavals of the period like the Maupeou Revolution, Louis XV's death, debates over tactical systems, and the financial crisis. Most of the post-war ministers, and especially after Choiseul, failed at this task. An experienced bureaucrat, perhaps one skilled at trading favors and building client networks, would perhaps have been able to navigate the period more effectively than a man renowned for his battlefield prowess. He might also have been more skilled at wringing precious funding out of the treasury, which was the paramount concern for the bureau of the period, as it was for the government at large. Most importantly, he would likely not have been wedded to his own preconceived notions of the army and its direction, opening him up to a wider range of suggestions, especially for reforms of doctrine. As it was, the experienced warriors who staffed the bureau after the war experienced only mixed success. Choiseul's lengthy tenure allowed major change to be implemented, building on the reforms of the prior decade. Sigure's did as well, although he deferred a lot of that to his war council. As Swan notes, the enfranchisement, or really the re-enfranchisement, of the upper nobility in the high offices of state created a nucleus of resistance to royal power, with some Enlightenment arguments against absolutism thrown in. None of the secretaries of state for war can really be thrown into this category, but they also didn't manage to navigate the issues at court like their predecessors prior to Beliel had done. None of them ever really managed to latch onto a court faction, especially after Choiseul. Some of that is because Louis XVI notoriously did not have a mistress around which a faction could form. The above argument should not be taken either as deterministic or out of context. A skillful minister of war with a powerful patron at court could perhaps have remained in office for a lengthy term and overseen reform of the army, but the bureau may simply have been unlucky in its lack of effective leadership. On the other hand, perhaps no administrator of any skill or extraction could have effected reform, given the significant challenges faced by the state and the army. Government's broke. Can't do much about that. Louis XVI, also not a terribly effective king. The French army did succeed in reforming itself, in large part despite the unsettled nature of its leadership. By the dawn of the revolution, it possessed a coherent doctrine, organization, education system, professional officer corps, and structure, as I and others have written and talked about. I've argued that the French Ministry of War underwent a significant change in its leadership in the mid-18th century. During the early half of the century, the secretaries of state for war came from the robe nobility and the magistracy, following the pattern established by the prior Bourbon kings and draw the most skilled administrators and bind them to the dynasty. This provided civilian and skilled direction for the bureau, allowing it to function as a bureau and defer military choices to field commanders. This also provided the potential for dynamic partnership of bureaucratic oversight and operational command, as demonstrated by the nascent system constructed by Secretaries of State for War Arganson and Palmy and Marshal Beliel in the interwar years. However, as the century progressed, a new model emerged, and the war ministry was led by experienced commanders from within the army itself, most of whom came from the upper nobility. Beliel played a critical role in this transition, taking over the war ministry in 1758 as the first of the military secretaries. The result was a ministry that lacked the bureaucratic touch of prior periods, leaving it less able to adapt to changing circumstance and condition after 1760, and especially after Choiseul's fall in 1770. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you, John. Our next speaker will be Colonel Jack Gill, and he's going to present his paper on rear area security in 1813. Jack?
Well, thanks very much, Michael. Let's see if we can make this work. I hope that's visible to everyone. We'll move here from an institutional history. Thanks very much, Jonathan. That was really fascinating. I promise, however, to not talk for 4 hours like home popham, as Jacqueline talked about in the previous session. And what I'll talk about, though, is in an operational sense, the rear area security problems that the French experienced in 1813 and try to put them in the context of Napoleon's previous campaigns. In doing so, let's see, how do we get this? There we go. In doing so, there are two terms that we'll deal with straight away. One is, what does rear area security mean? And in my sense, we're talking about protecting allies. In Napoleon's case in 1813, that particularly relates to the Confederation of the Rhine states, but also conquered territories, lines of communication, and protecting them from internal unrest as well as external raids. The internal unrest being the primary concern here in 1813. It's a critical component of strategy, but it often gets overlooked. The other term that we'll come upon are what in German would be Streifkorps or Parteigänger, Partisanen. These are raiding detachments, not guerrillas, which is to say they're composed of light troops, mostly regulars and Cossacks, and they're independent operators moving behind enemy lines to disturb your opponent. Again, not guerrillas. If you're interested in the development of that term, partisan, which is really quite interesting, I recommend Martin Brink and Beatrice Heuser on this topic. So what I'll do is talk a little bit about Napoleon's rear area security system prior to 1813, what happens in 1813, why it failed, the nature of the threat, the nature of the response, and the consequences of the failure. Prior to 1813, Napoleon combined reality and very clever deception to protect his rear areas while focusing on the main enemy. That meant reliance on second line troops, including allies, but second line, more or less untrained, often brand new French conscripts or National Guards, and others of that ilk. He would inflate the numbers and inflate the unit title. So in one case, at least, there is a group of about 4,000 men who are given the grand title of army, and appoint senior commanders who are well known internationally that therefore made the unit seem more important than they were, or more powerful than they were. And he's assisted in this by the aura of victory that has accompanied him and the French arms generally in the period. He applied this to both internal threats, primarily in Germany, although Italy is another issue we could talk about. It's a separate problem, and external, such as Walcheren in 1809 that Jeremy Black talked about yesterday. There are other factors in Germany that are important here. First off, most Germans at the time, up to 1812, are either reticent or actively hostile to Napoleon's enemies. So they're not going to join raiding parties and go against the French in most cases. And the enemy was fairly obliging in that enemy efforts were more or less limited and poorly coordinated, poorly supported. So Napoleon will not have to distract himself or divert any major forces from his main theater operations, be that the Danube Valley or often Poland. And indeed, success in those main theaters redounds to the benefit of the rear area security in that it bolsters Napoleon's forces and undermines his enemies. But the system fails in 1813. Now, Napoleon is very aware of the danger and he tries to mitigate it, but that does not succeed, largely because everything has been undercut by the devastating effects of the Russian campaign. And those effects are both material and psychological, as you may well imagine. In the first place, his entire army is now more or less second line. So where do you find the troops who are going to be the veterans to face the main enemy and then others who will deal with rear area problems? It's especially true of the cavalry. If we can take take any example of the cavalry. Andrew Roberts talks about this and uses some very interesting language to describe the cavalry problems. And the French aura of victory, of course, is also mostly evaporated. Combine that with the terror of the enemy's cavalry, in particular Cossacks, and it's difficult to overemphasize that. I'll talk about that a bit more in a second. In the meantime, of course, the enemy is emboldened. So they intend to press the very weakened French, who they see as being timorous, at least initially, and they're going to stress what they perceive, quite rightly, as their superiority in cavalry. But there's some other factors to consider. One of those is what we might call geographic, in that France, more or less in inverted commas, to use what our British friends term our British friends use, France now extends all the way to Hamburg and Lübeck in Germany. So the French territory is now very close to the front line. Indeed, the front line is very close to Napoleon's lines of communication. And much of Germany is now, if not actively hostile to the French, very, very restive. So that leaves Napoleon with little to no margin for error. I mentioned the Cossacks and the image of the Cossacks. And this is a drawing, a sketch by a Württemberg officer from 1812 who went through the 1812 campaign and 1813. And it gives a sense of how the Cossacks were thought about. So even soldiers, and most of Napoleon's soldiers in 1813 had not gone to Russia, but even those who did not, the terror of this image of Cossacks was important to them in terms of presenting a danger to which they felt they often had no response. The threat, though, the real threat, was from these small raiding detachments. As I mentioned, Streifkorps, Parteigänger. These were composed of Cossacks and regular cavalry, sometimes with a few light guns, but never more than 6. So 2 to 6 light cannons, occasionally small bodies of infantry, but very few so-called patriotic volunteers. And the patriotic volunteers that did exist were mostly Prussians, so not other Germans, citizens or subjects of the Confederation of the Rhine states. These groups are seldom more than 2,000, and some as little as 200 to 300. Obviously, leadership is key. Bold, initiative officers, very aggressive, with a lot of initiative and energy. So the image shows a band called the Lützow Freikorps, the Freikorps of Major Ludwig Adolf von Lützow. And certainly they were present, but they were not so numerous. They were not so effective. And so we really have more romance than rebellion in this sort of imagery. Here we have the famous soldier poet Theodor Körner declaiming some lines to his enthusiastic fellows, but they were not the real problem for Napoleon. The real problem were regular Russian and Prussian cavalry and Cossacks. These raiders were to operate in, this is a quote from Blücher, but you can find the same sorts of things from Kutuzov or Gneisenau and Scharnhorst, operate in the enemy's rear and make the entire enemy's rear insecure. The roads are to be unsafe, surprise garrisons, seize couriers, seize senior officials, because there are senior French officials in the rear areas and they're looking to capture them too. The raising of uprisings doesn't happen as much, but they're very effective at these other tasks. The Kingdom of Westphalia under Napoleon's youngest brother, Jérôme, was a special target of these raiders because they saw that as weak and a point that they could exploit, a chink in Napoleon's armor, if you will. Their deceptions are very effective and they play upon French fears, so their reports of them are often exaggerated in their strengths and their actions and their mobility, serving their purposes. Napoleon, of course, takes countermeasures to prevent accidents, as the French term was at the time, and to purge the region of raiders. So garrisons and fortresses were to be strongly held. You couldn't just leave a few soldiers in a town on your line of communications. You had to have enough to hold off a substantial raiding party. And there were very strict security procedures implemented for every column of replacements and supplies. What the US Army, in my day at least, would have called marching tactically, that is, prepared to defend yourself at any time, not administratively just sort of tromping along from point to point. They also used flying columns, as they were called in those days, to operate en partisan in an effort to hunt down the Allied raiding groups. And at one point in mid-September 1813, there are, if you tote them all up in various parts of the rear area for the French, something on the order of 20,000 French and Poles and Germans committed to these tasks. But there's also a problem on the tactical battlefield, because the Cossacks are so prevalent, so ubiquitous, that soldiers marching into battle have to often march in square and place their baggage between their columns, which means columns of march into battle are slow and cumbersome. Rosberg and Denowitz are two examples here. And it also means the French cavalry can't do very well penetrating to gather intelligence on where the enemy is and what they might be doing. In effect then, oops, how do I go back? Let's try this. In effect then, despite the French countermeasures, the cost is high to Napoleon and his army in terms of men, horses, materiel, money. At one point, a Saxon treasury convoy of $142,000 is intercepted by Cossacks, who must have been very happy Cossacks, and of course, food. But not just in terms of losses, but also in terms of the large numbers of troops diverted to guard the line of communication, guard convoys, etc. It also imposed, these raiding parties also imposed, of course, time delays on the arrivals of reinforcements and supplies. So they hindered Napoleon's ability to gather intelligence and to conduct command because communications are intercepted. And of course, on the other side, they gather lots of information for his enemies. They distract him and his other commanders from their main enemy on the battlefield. And they hamper tactical movement, as I mentioned, even on the battlefield. As a Saxon brigade commander says, oh yes, our constant companions, the Cossacks, they were ubiquitous. So of course, the conclusion is a very corrosive effect on French and Rhinebund Confederation of the Rhine morale. It encourages the anti-French elements in the armies, but also in the general populations and in the ruling elements of the Confederation of the Rhine states, while discouraging the French and their allies. So just to cite a few examples here, here's the beginning of 1813, February to April, and we see Prince Eugène commanding the army while Napoleon is organizing things in Paris. He's in Posen in the Duchy of Warsaw, Poland, and several detachments are destroyed on his left flank, his northern flank. And that's a factor in his retreat because he feels himself surrounded. While Cossacks have showed up in Berlin and panicked Marshal Augereau, who's the commandant in Berlin. A group of about 1,200 Cossacks enters Hamburg because the French garrison has had to leave. Hamburg, to remind you again, is supposedly a French city. So this is a huge propaganda victory for the Allies. They also captured Lübeck. They disrupt the efforts of the German states to mobilize. Berthier writes to Ney as the French army is gathering to march west to the east, that the left bank of the Saale River, so there on the slide you can see the Saale towards Erfurt, the left bank of the Saale is inundated by enemy bands, and that those kinds of terms, inundated, infested, flooded with, are what you encounter repeatedly in the French correspondence on this. Napoleon even has to advise a general from Baden that he should travel in civilian clothes on his return to his capital of Karlsruhe in order to evade capture by Cossacks and raiding parties. Things don't get any better in May and June, even as Napoleon comes in, wins the battles of Lützen and Bautzen. Just to highlight the first of these, where a convoy from the imperial headquarters itself is attacked just behind the main army. Napoleon launches a major investigation into this and punishes the gendarmes who were supposed to protect this by putting them in prison, while praising the one fellow who does the right thing. He receives the membership in the Legion of Honor. As General Axo says, from Magdeburg, the couriers are intercepted, even just going to a place as close as Leipzig. And again, the commandant in Wittenberg, General Lapointe, Cossacks have infested the whole country. And he recommends it's time to take serious measures to rid ourselves of these bandits. Well, they do attempt it was certainly high time to get rid of the bandits, but the efforts do not succeed. The French do regain Hamburg, but the entire area along the Elbe River, in other words, the main operating area of the army, is insecure. So we see on the right bank, the eastern bank, the destruction of a large ammunition convoy destined for Marshal MacDonald. In between the major supply depot in Dresden and MacDonald's forces off towards the town of Bautzen. Raids into all over Westphalia, again, a major target, including the capital city of Kassel, held for several days by a party that doesn't number more than 2,000 or 3,000 Russians raiding into the heart of Westphalia. And defeats inflicted on some of these flying columns that were endeavoring to stop the raiders. So in summary then, a few observations. I hope this discussion has highlighted the importance of rear area security in 1813. I'm not trying to suggest that the rear area lapses were the sole cause of Napoleon's defeat that year, but they're certainly a major contributing factor where the previously successful system now fails. It weakens his forces and commanders materially in terms of men and horses and supplies, but also mentally, if we think about the distraction and just sort of the mental exhaustion of having to worry about whether or not your communications are secure. And then psychologically, both to military forces, but also the political and popular morale of Napoleon's allies. So the previous margin for error that Napoleon had enjoyed in the past is now erased. And in my mind, the failure of his system in 1813 and the successes of these coalition Streifkorps, raiding parties, raiding detachments, are symptoms of the Grande Armée's decline and also accelerants to its future and further erosion as the campaign progresses. So I'm happy to talk about the sources in the question period if that's of interest to anyone, but here's some of the principal things I used. The Prussian military regimental histories, curiously enough, often contain reports of the partisan or these reconnaissance raiding detachments leaders back to Blücher and others, so quite interesting. And with that, I'll thank you very much and turn things back to Dr. Leggiere.
All right, thank you very much, Colonel Gill. All right, our third and final paper is by Dr. John Morgan, and it is titled The Revolt of the Catalan Audiencia in 1809, Napoleonic Command and the Last Stand of the Ancien Regime. Dr. Morgan, nice to see you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. And I do hope we do this again year after year. On the 6th of April of 1809, Napoleonic governor of Barcelona, General Guillaume Duhain, met with Captain General of Catalonia, General Garrisons de Villalba, and issued an order to have the provincial and municipal authorities of the civil and military, both civil and military, in Barcelona proceed to the palace of the Real Audiencia, or Supreme Court, to take the oath of allegiance and obedience to King Joseph Napoleon the First under the imperial decree of 12 November of 1808, which granted an amnesty to all government administrators who had betrayed their previous oaths to the Constitution of Bayonne of 1808. King Joseph reassumed his throne after the interregnum following the French disaster at Beliel, and demanded of his state officers and administrators to again pledge their loyalty. General Duhain, the governor of Barcelona and commander of the two divisions that occupied the city, which was part of General Gouvion Saint-Cyr's 7th Corps, and Saint-Cyr had named Duhain commandant of the principality with full political powers, making him the governor of the province with military powers over the garrison of Barcelona. It is with this political power normally exercised by a general-in-chief that Duhain on the 6th of April met with the captain general and president of the Real Audiencia, Lieutenant General Garrisons de Villalba, and ordered him to call for a general session of the Real Audiencia to be attended by all civil and military authorities in Barcelona, all wearing their formal dress and uniforms to parade, led by General Duhain from the Plaza de Saint-Jean to the Palace of the Audiencia, where the jurists and other magistrates would pledge their oath of loyalty. The central character in the revolt of the Audiencia and the whole occupation was the office of the general-in-chief, who commanded an independent army with extensive powers limited only by imperial command authority. General Duhain, assigned as commander of the Corps d'Observation de la Pyrénées Orientale, received instructions from the emperor to take command of the division under General Joseph Leche, to enter Spain, march on Barcelona, and make contact with the Captain General, then a Captain General Ezpeleta, and inform him that the emperor's orders specified that he would that his corps would march to Cadiz, but while in Barcelona, the Spanish government must provide support to the French troops under the provisions of the Treaty of Fontainebleau. Duhain's secret orders were to capture the citadel and Fort Mongy in Barcelona, as well as Fort San Fernando at Figueres, to be completed by March of 1808. This gave Duhain additional power vis-a-vis the Captain General, as the French presence degenerated into an obvious occupation by the 1st of May of 1808. The institution which General Duhain encountered governing Catalonia were those of the Nueva Planta, the settlement following the War of the Spanish Succession. The Captain General was appointed by the king, and he was the senior military commander over regular and militia troops within the province. He was the provincial governor. He was president of the Audiencia. Although not a jurist, he was the king's direct representative, and he was the controller general of the royal administration. The Audiencia was a provincial high or appellate court similar to the French provincial parlement. Its chief jurist was the regent. It consisted of 2 civil chambers led by the regent, and a criminal chamber led by a governor. The civil magistrates were called oidores, while the criminal magistrates were as ministers of the criminal court. This was a part of the Captain General's instrument of governance. It registered the decrees and other legal and administrative acts. It had oversight over the police apparatus. It was a political and administrative advisory body to the Captain General. In this, it acted in a role that was very close to that of a French parlement. General Duhain entered Barcelona on the 14th of February at the head of a 1st Brigade of General Leche's Italian division. Captain General Espeleta issued an edict to his provincial and municipal authorities and concurred, which was concurred by the regent of the Audiencia, to cooperate with the French under the existing treaty requirements. During the month of February, the Spanish authorities worked with General Duhain under the alliance to satisfy the needs of his troops. On the 28th, General Duhain took the main fortress at Mongy and the citadel in Barcelona in a surprise coup de main, then occupied the minor forts of the city. In Upper Catalonia, his troops captured Fort Figueres. These acts caused a decisive shift in the Catalan public and official opinion as to the conviction of the French presence as an invasion as opposed to a friendly occupation of territory. In mid-July, with the insurrectionary war in Catalonia fully engaged, Duhain launched an expedition to besiege Girona, taking with him a division and leaving behind at Barcelona General Leche as superior commandant or commandant superior of the city and a 1 brigade garrison. During Duhain's absence, Leche established himself as a dictator, in quotes, of Barcelona, and with it decisively moved the government of the city to the commander's hands. The expedition of Girona signaled to the Catalan insurrection and to the insurrectionary Captain General Jean Miguel de Vives an opportunity to recapture Barcelona, which was under blockade since the summer of 1808. General Leche took extraordinary steps to hold the city through terror. He thrust aside any consideration of the Captain General and local government. He totally disarmed its citizens through house-to-house searches, extended curfews, searches of convents and churches, and using internal passports. He used arbitrary arrests and hostage-taking and established an extraordinary tribunal with capital powers. When Duhain returned to Barcelona after its failed siege on the 20th of August of 1808, he continued General Leche's authoritarian regime. On the 23rd of August, Duhain threw off all pretense of cooperative or allied government. He informed the Captain General that he was assuming the material or the mantle of the head of government at Barcelona. And he justified his action by arguing that the Spanish government in Catalonia had collapsed into chaos, which was fundamentally true. On 13 September, General Duhain formalized his position as head of the Catalan government and assumed the de facto position of a general-in-chief by decreeing that Barcelona was in a state of siege and subject to martial law. For the city was, in fact, blockaded by General Vives and invested by the sea by a squadron of the Royal Navy. In this declaration, Duhain asserted sole authority over Spanish civil and military state apparatus in Barcelona, though he retained existing Spanish institutions. The Audiencia, too, retained its position and role in government. Duhain specified that all government officials who had kept to their posts would continue under this new authority. Those who deserted their posts or otherwise resisted the government would be arrested and transported to France. The state of siege decree established the final stage of Duhain's improvised government, which retained the existing institutions but grafted upon them ad hoc structures and policies designed to meet the challenges of the occupation. Duhain had placed Barcelona on the path to assimilation into the French Empire. His state of siege decree and its assertion of governorship caused considerable fallout and brought down Captain General Expeleta's flat refusal to recognize Duhain's assertion of authority. Expeleta published a letter objecting to the decree and its refusal to recognize Duhain's authority. His action as president of the Audiencia resembled that of the remonstrance of a parlement. In response, Duhain removed the Captain General from office, arrested and imprisoned him in the citadel. And by the way, he also arrested the rest of his family, and they were placed in a convent. Duhain replaced Expeleta with the aged Lieutenant General de Villalba. He then called together the provincial and military authorities and secured their submission to French authority, although not the oath as yet. Duhain was acting the part of a latter-day Maupin who exiled the magistrates of the Parlement of Paris in 1770, and he did the same with Expeleta. In this action, Duhain no longer, as Conrad states, accepted discussion, temporization, or evasion of his orders, only obedience. He treated the Spanish authorities as his agents, and as he was, as governor, acted in the name of the emperor. On the 17th of September, Duhain's arrest and Expeleta's manifesto was published in the official newspaper of the city, the Diario de Barcelona, causing further sensation and anger in the city. These events precipitated a further exodus of government officials and others from the city, notably the regent of the Audiencia, Justice Olea. Also, 3 other judges fled the city, and on the 18th of September, 2 more fled, and the clerk of the court was actually arrested a month later. During this period from September to March of 1809, Duhain's repressions and exactions continued as General Vives invested Barcelona in coordination with a British naval blockade. This cooperation threatened the capture of Barcelona, but in the autumn of 1808, Napoleon added 3 new divisions to the corps in Catalonia under the title of the new 7th Corps. When General Gouvion Saint-Cyr captured Roses in November, he marched with 2 divisions to relieve Barcelona in mid-December. He defeated the Spanish forces at Cardedeu, relieved the blockade of the city, and before Christmas again defeated them at Molins de Rey, which forced Vives to withdraw beyond the Llobregat River and towards Tarragona after the French victory at Valls in February of 1809. These victories changed the strategic situation in Catalonia and threw the army of the Junta de Superior de Catalunya back on its heels. It secured Barcelona and throttled the morale of the insurgent movement in Barcelona. Gouvion Saint-Cyr regained the initiative in Lower Catalonia and allowed Duhain to retain it also in Barcelona. In February, King Joseph decreed the administration of a new oath of allegiance that magistrates and military officers must submit in writing to their respective ministries. A month later, the Royal Commissioner of Catalonia, Joseph Garriga, tasked with the establishment of a new royal administration in the province, arrived in Lower Catalonia in the baggage of a French division that was posted near Barcelona. We think that was General Souham's division. Here, he was presented to General Leche at Granollers, who was engaged in a punitive anti-insurgent expedition. Garriga next met the Commissioner General of Police, Ramon Casanova, who issued a pass to Barcelona, while General Leche assigned him a military escort. However, Garriga was fired upon by insurgents and nearly killed near Barcelona, and he declined entering the city, only to return to Figueres. No doubt the administration of an oath was part of his mission, but he returned without completing any task at all. Thus far, Duhain had not enacted the February oath decree, but the arrival of the royal commissaire Garriga indicated Joseph's desire to take a stronger executive stand in Spain. Additionally, Gouvion Saint-Cyr and Napoleon were convinced that his victory at Valls would give the strategic leverage to complete the conquest of Catalonia and begin the process of bringing the province into the Napoleonic fold. The time was right then for Duhain to enact King Joseph's oath decree. Thinking that Valls had placed the Spanish authorities in an obedient frame of mind, which even their fears of vengeance from their insurrectionary compatriots was overcome by the inevitability of French victory. After all, a number of Walloon Guards officers had taken the oath in the previous November, and the sacking of Espeleta and the appointment of Villalba saw only some immigration, but no organized resistance. Finally, the Spanish bureaucracy had acted with considerable timidity and was not likely to rebel at the risk of imprisonment or death, while the offer of advancement provided a carrot. Confident of success, General Duhain issued the summons to Captain General Villalba to convoke the Audiencia and other authorities of the provincial government. Villalba, however, begged off personal attendance due to his infirmities. He was a very aged man, but he sent the summons directly to the Audiencia. One of the magistrates, the fiscal civil, that is the head of the civil chambers, a man by the name of Juan Madavecchia, who was a pro-Napoleonic partisan, actively campaigned amongst his colleagues to take the oath. Duhain also wanted to use members of the Junta General, that's the main deliberative body, to assist the Captain General. They wanted to leverage them and other officials with temptations of honors that they would receive for serving the emperor. Duhain had thought that he had prepared the ground for acceptance of the oath. On the morning of the 9th, of April, a great crowd had gathered at the entrance of the palace of the Audiencia. Officials in formal dress parading to the Audiencia were now beginning to arrive. Captain General Villalba, too ill to attend, had sent a messenger bearing his written refusal to swear. General Duhain, in dress uniform and accompanied by his staff, paraded from the Plaza de Saint-Jean to the Audiencia with the others. At the entrance, there was General Gouvion Saint-Cyr, as Duhain had arrived, followed by the Spanish officials. There was a large detachment of soldiers there with other military detachments nearby. General Duhain opened the session after the government dignitaries were seated, as in a provincial lit de justice held by a governor. As in all such events in old regime France, the governor would give a speech to convince, cajole, or threaten the magistrates to comply and register the bill that the king desired. Duhain, too, gave a speech that flattered and threatened the assembled dignitaries. Then he addressed the operative question to each member of the Audiencia individually. Do you swear fidelity and obedience to King Joseph Napoleon I, King of Spain, to the laws and to the Constitution? In posing this question individually and publicly to the magistrates, he expected his advance work to pay off and the magistrates to fall into line and swear. The most senior magistrate of the fiscal civil, a Jaime Alvarez de Mendieta, rose before Duhain and refused to swear the oath. He was followed by other refusals, and then the entire body of officials erupted in loud refusals, which drowned out the few who answered yes and swore, such as Judge Magnavecchia. This revolt, like a parliamentary remonstrance, was an embarrassing and potentially explosive situation that could spill out into the streets and was only restrained by the presence of French troops. With the streets near the Audiencia packed with people anxious to hear of the victory of the Audiencia over Duhain, quick action was needed, and General Gouvion Saint-Cyr ordered the arrest of those who refused the oath. Troops quickly entered and arrested those in attendance. The military officers were imprisoned in the citadel, while the civilians, to include the magistrates and other personnel of the Audiencia, were held at Fort Magique. Gouvion Saint-Cyr retained Villalba as captain general despite his refusal, for there was no one else senior enough to hold the post. Faced with this sudden personnel dearth, Duhain saw the need to bring new men into the Audiencia and other parts of the Spanish administration. And he promoted Magnavecchia to be the regent or chief justice. Later in the day, Duhain had the city intendant and regent Magnavecchia administer the oath to their various junior personnel with similar refusals. Duhain then issued an order expelling any who refused the oath from the city. All of this necessitated the reorganization of the Catalan administration in Barcelona. Not only were new personnel needed, but it also affected the workflow and procedures of the administration, necessitating even broader reform. In the face of this embarrassing disaster of his startling revolt, the improvised government showed that it had failed to gain the loyalty of its personnel. It necessitated structural and procedural reform, indicating the failure of the French command to put the government in Catalonia on a firm footing within the Napoleonic state system. General Duhain's attempt to administer the oath to the Audiencia failed, but his technique here was not irrational. Duhain, as a young notary, had to study the Parlement and its procedures. He probably learned this from the provincial lit de justice of the Parlement at Rennes, such as that in 1788, in which the commandant of the province of Brittany convoked the Parlement in the formal manner with a procession of its magistrates, an oath to the crown, and the demand to register the act in question. Military units were also present in a number of these procedures. Duhain's was an innovative use of the traditional procedures, and his display of respect for such formal usages would likely earn some respect from the Spanish authorities. Duhain, no doubt, wished to exploit a public forum in which no one could keep his political preferences secret and beyond retribution. But when Judge Mendieta made his stand along with the refusal in absentia of the regent, the dam broke and the flood of refusals overwhelmed the event, leaving only force as a response. The arrest and imprisonment of the magistrates too resembled a royal arrest under lettre de cachet of recalcitrant justices in the remonstrances of a parlement. General Duhain did not reckon on the presence of a large and hostile crowd that heartened those in the Audiencia. There was a clear rejection of Joseph I as king in favor of Ferdinand VII, and the crowd surely communicated this to the various administrators as they paraded to the Audiencia that morning. The reaction of the crowd also rewarded the Audiencia, which was hailed as heroes, especially with the collective arrests that day. Meanwhile, the public condemned Judge Mendieta and the handful of other dignitaries who had taken the oath as traitors. Most important consequence of this was that it gave heart to the continued resistance in Barcelona after the disasters inflicted by Gouvion Saint-Cyr in the field, but put a Catalan victory out of reach to the Junta Superior. Resistance in the city then remained underground. The main threat to French rule was large conspiracies. A gigantic one was formed in December and involved thousands. Postponed in March of 1809, it was discovered and broken up in May. It was this revolt of the Audiencia that opened a space for such ambitious conspiracies. The victory of the Audiencia was also its last stand, for General Duhain not only replaced recalcitrant jurists, he began the process of broader reforms and completely changed the institution into a tribunal along French lines. This victory then was a last stand of the Audiencia. And I would note too that at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Justice Meidenavecchia, he disappeared. Now, in the chaos of the retreat from Barcelona in May of 1814, he apparently left with the garrison after destroying the court's archives from 1808 to all the way to 1814. So it's a source that we have almost nothing from. In any case, he apparently got to France, and from there he disappears. They think he died in 1816. We just don't know. He just simply falls out of the picture. But he's an interesting character by himself. Thank you
very much, Dr. Morgan. Questions, we don't have very many, so please send them in so I can relay them to our speakers. First question is for Dr. Abel from Professor Schneid, and it reads, since the French army was at war in the 1730s and 1740s, did Beliel ever determine if the camp maneuvers had a practical impact on the performance of those regiments that had trained at the camps on campaign?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and that the answer to that is deep in several sets of French archives. So There is a fantastic study done by the French staff between 1899 and 1902, where they copiously used a lot of these kinds of documents, but they tend to only be on the camp side. So there's lots of reports of Beliel writing back saying, you know, our cavalry can't maneuver at all. And then after the camp, of course, every single camp practitioner writes to the war minister, the camp was amazing, everybody did great. But in terms of connecting it to actual battlefield performance, the tendency is to say that the performance was traditional. So even though you have these reform efforts starting in especially the 1740s with the rise of Prussia, and there is no catalyst for it. The French are not looking at the Prussians and saying they're doing well. They just kind of do it. There's no real catalyzing event. So they tend to revert to what they know in war. And the point of a lot of the papers I've presented here and a lot of my kind of writing over the years is that this is a process, and it's a process that's incredibly uneven. And it's a process also that is not finished until the Wars of the Revolution. So you have a theory in place by 1788, but it's not practiced until later. And of course, there are barriers to that. You have to have functional officers for one. The immigration helps a lot with that. But no, I think that's a good question that deserves a better look and a better link to see how on the one hand, you have these administrative records largely in the BNF and the AF, and on the other hand, you have these records at Massena, and it'd be interesting to see if there is a link between them. I have not run across something that explicit where they say, you know, something we did in the camp 10 years ago is helping us now. But that's certainly an area of research to look at in the future.
Okay, next question is for Colonel Gill from Claudio Mann, UNT, my student. What was the effect of Cossack raids on the civilian population of Germany? Did these partisan raids affect the support of the local population for the Allied cause because they were terrorized by these irregulars/partisans?
That's a great question, and the whole issue of Cossacks and the civilian population is a fascinating one. I have not researched that in great depth, but it is there's initially a great deal of curiosity, and there are wonderful images, paintings of the time, sketches and whatnot of Cossacks showing up in villages and cities and whatnot because they were so exotic. And we use the term Cossacks very loosely. Many of these men were not Cossacks in a strict sense. They were Kalmuks and Bashkirs and others from even further to the east in the Tsarist Empire. So they weren't really Cossacks, and so they were even more exotic. And so there was a lot of interest in them. But they could also, once the exoticism wore off and they were in town for a while, they tended to, there's some charming things because where they might be charmed by some woman playing the piano. And then there are many instances where they were quite happy to take the piano away or anything else that was movable and they could pack up on their ponies and drive off with. So the reaction to the Cossacks varies a lot. Anyone who is opposed to the French, on the other hand, is encouraged. So the French garrison commander, for example, in Leipzig, Margueron, writes to Berthier saying, this is in September, I think, saying, look, we can't conduct the requisitions to get the flour and the other provisions we're supposed to supply to you because the countryside is infested with Cossacks. And so the people feel they can be reticent. They can say, oh, sorry, we can't help you, and would feel encouraged not to support the French in any way. But it's a great question, and one that I'm hoping my continued research will give me a little more insights into.
Okay, another question for you, Colonel Gill. This one is from our gracious host, Alex Mikabaritsa. Are the failures you describe reflecting the exhaustion of Napoleon's system after 1812, or the Allies' ability to learn from earlier experiences? So are the failures reflect the exhaustion of Napoleon's system after 1812, or the Allies' ability to learn from earlier experiences?
I think it's a measure of both. And it would be interesting to see in particular how the Russians write about this. I've been looking at things I don't read Russian, so I've been looking at things like Bogdanovich and whatnot for the Russian side. But it would be interesting to see how the Russians reacted or regarded the successes that the Cossacks in particular had enjoyed in 1812 in helping to pursue the French out of Russia. Because it's very clear from both what Russian materials are available in French and German, and certainly from the Prussian writings, that the Allies are absolutely convinced that the French cavalry is gone, and they have a great advantage. And it's right, they do. They have a great advantage in the mounted arm, and they are going to exploit that to the hilt. And so they they intentionally send, and as part of their larger strategy, send these raiding detachments well ahead of the main forces. And keeping in mind, of course, that the Russians are as exhausted as the French by the time they get into the Vistula River and they're in Poland. The Russian main armies are exhausted. But they can send these small detachments ahead, and because the French are in such a dire situation, these detachments have an effect well out of proportion to their size. So I think it's, on the one hand, the collapse of the French forces, and the Allies exploiting an advantage that has come to them because they have these mounted forces that they can send and gain this large advantage.
Okay, thank you, Colonel Gill. Next question is for Dr. Morgan. Did the population of Barcelona differentiate the Italians like Leche from the French, or did they see them all as French invaders?
Well, that's an excellent question. And there hasn't been much work done on that, but from the archival and material that's available, the population did differentiate between them. The Italians, in the area of military discipline, the Italian soldiers did incur the anger of the local population in Barcelona very deeply, but they were still seen as different from the French. And when you saw occasionally, there were attempts to get Napoleonic soldiers to desert. They always approached the Italian ones first. Also, when you see cases of guerrilla murders of French soldiers, you'll see the ones that are national Frenchmen are usually killed. The Italians were often asked to join the guerrillas or face death, but they were at least given that choice.
Okay, another question for you, Dr. Morgan. Upon seizing the Spanish crown, Napoleon said, "Spaniards, after a long agony, your nation was perishing. I have seen your pain and I am bringing you a remedy." To what extent do you think he was right to say such a thing? Does the chaos and disorder of the Spanish government give a legitimate casus belli to your revolutionary neighbor, which is also your ally?
Well, what's really interesting about that is the popular impression that Napoleon had made upon both upper class as well as the general public in particularly places like Madrid. Napoleon was not seen as interfering as long as it appeared that he was backing the regime of Ferdinand VII. He was seen as friendly. And he had many more adherents to his presence. Even the military presence was given a little bit of credit. The issue of discipline also comes into that too, because it's on the local level, it often colors local perceptions of the French presence. So in Napoleon's orders or initial orders to Duhain, he simply says, have the first Italian soldier that gets out of line, have him shot, which he did. A Italian sergeant major had gotten to a quarrel with a local merchant and had drawn a sword and cut the man. And Duhain immediately had him arrested and he was shot. So they were actually given some credit. It was after Napoleon disavowed Ferdinand that things began to more rapidly change, and they saw an invasion far more clearly than they saw an alliance. But the chaos, yeah, there's no doubt about that. I mean, it was absolute pandemonium, particularly in the Madrid region. In Barcelona, things were calmer, but so it was an issue of anxiety. The mails were always late, so when they get the news of the riots in Barcelona of the 2nd of May, they only get that news in the 3rd week of the month. And, you know, when the news hits the papers or the mails, because the mails weren't coming through adequately, yeah, they were near riots then. And you did see, starting at Manresa, which is north of Barcelona, you did see an active insurgency bubble up. And it spread throughout the province between the 4th or 5th of June, and once it had started, you know, it never ceased.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Morgan. This question is for Colonel Gill. Is it true that Cossacks had an admiration for Murat to the extent that they avoided targeting him? If there was sometimes friendly contact or trade between the Cossacks and the French, does this indicate that the interests of the Cossacks were more mercenary than patriotic?
Well, it's a great question, but it kind of goes beyond my knowledge of Cossacks. I would say that it makes complete sense that the Cossacks would have admired someone like Murat, or his panache and his exotic costumes and his horsemanship and his fame across Europe at that time. Makes complete sense. They would have admired him in some sense, but it's hard for me to imagine that they would have not targeted him had the opportunity arisen, because soldiers and Cossacks of any variety gained great honor and often material rewards if you could bring in an enemy general or a colonel and say, oh yes, I captured the commander of this regiment or what have you. That was much to your advantage. So I cannot believe that they would not have nabbed him if that had been possible. He's almost captured at Leipzig, but not by Cossacks, by Prussians. And I don't know, I've not seen anything that indicates there was much fraternization, unlike, say, during the American Civil War between the sides, between the French and the Cossacks. In fact, there's a wonderful anecdote of as the Oudinot's army is retreating from Grossbeeren, they're harangued by Cossacks or harassed by Cossacks the entire way, and the Cossacks apparently would come up to the German soldiers, the Saxons, because the inaccuracy of the weapons of the day meant you could come quite close if you're on a good fast horse and get away. And they would say, "Oh, don't you lads want to march to Berlin?" as they were retreating away from their effort to go towards Berlin. So they're taunting the Saxons and other German soldiers. I would imagine they did the same thing with the French, but I have not seen really anything that indicates there was much fraternization among the sides.
Okay, this question is for Dr. Morgan. Did Suchet later find success in pacifying Catalonia by reversing the early approach of Duhain or by building on it?
Well, he did not occupy Barcelona. He did manage the conquest of most of Lower Catalonia, which would include the sieges of Lerida, Tortosa, and Tarragona. Once that had been done, he was able to better pacify those portions of Lower Catalonia than his colleagues, Duhain in one case, or even Saint-Cyr. But Saint-Cyr never really involved himself too much outside of the purely military issues. He never really involved himself in government or governance or the actual occupation. He left a lot of that work to Duhain. You only start seeing a more balanced approach come when Marshal MacDonald comes in.
Okay, this question is for Dr. Abel. Is there continuity between Napoleon's camp of Boulogne and Beliel's camps?
Yeah, I think definitely. What you see is that there's a transition in what the camp is. So it's invented, the first camp it's debated, but sometime in the 17th century. And Louis the 14th has camps to train his cavalry and to show off to his neighbors. They're always suspiciously close to Germany. But then when they're revived in 1727, and I have yet to discover why 1727, that's also one of the years the Prussians start to do a lot of things. So something's happening in that year. I just don't know what yet. When they're revived, they're very much more practical. It is very clear that the army does not know what it's doing. Its experienced NCOs are leaving because, of course, France hasn't fought in a war for 15 years, excepting the Quadruple Alliance. Doesn't really count. And from that point on, it's very clear that the camp is designed to build a functional army in the same way that a camp would work before a campaign. So the idea, of course, is traditionally you pull the army together and the commander, Turenne, in the spring, pulls the army together, gives them his doctrine, then they go out and fight his campaign. And the next year's commander will do the same thing in the next, on and on. But by the 18th century, it's very clear that they need to do this across the administration. They need to do it across the entire bureaucracy. And they can no longer rely on a single individual, because that's great when you have a Turenne. That's not so great when you have a Soubise, as the French find out in the 7 Years' War. So there's very much a continuity in the sense of Boulogne is about building an army, not from scratch, of course, but it's about building an army from the constituent parts that you have and melding it into an institution that is more than just the tool of a person. So we're very much seeing the transition from personalized solutions to institutional solutions. And then, of course, the Prussians take that idea and run completely with it to abstract the personal out of it even more. I think we're definitely seeing a continuity in the evolution of what people like Michael Roberts and Michael Howard would call this professionalization of the institution.
Okay, another question for you, Dr. Abel. How open were was the French High Command to foreign advisors' ideas such as the exiled Jacobites, Irish or others, or was the advice not very good anyway?
No, that's an excellent question, and they were very open. Interestingly, I found a really interesting anecdote. There was a Prussian who was smuggled into one of the camps as an observer and advisor. He was smuggled in by the camp commander. And I think to try to protect him from the men. I think there was enough anti-German sentiment, and this is not post 7 Years' War. This is I believe in the 1740s or 50s. But the French were very open to foreign ideas, not from England. The French are constant in their drumbeat of the English do not have a martial tradition. They don't do anything. Their army is worthless. They, of course, accept the Irish, as long as they're willing to die for France as, co-religionists. But they are very concerned with what the Germans are doing. And they're also very concerned with what the Italians are doing because they view the Italians as the godfathers of siege warfare. So you see these kind of dual trends. And interestingly enough, the Guizard book that I mentioned about the École Royale Militaire, he goes into detail on the curriculum at the École Royale Militaire. And you can see this transition happen, where the French are interested in what's happening in Germany more and more throughout the century, to the point that they displace Italian from the curriculum for their future officers and replace it with German. There's also a discussion at the time to whether or not they need to do the same with English. And the English comes and goes, but the German is pretty constant. So what I would say is we have this image. And if Kenny Johnson is here, he's probably laughing as I'm saying this because we talk about it all the time. We have this image of the old regime as being this kind of decrepit skeleton wandering around waiting to be hit over the head. But in reality, it's a time of great reform. And it's a time where everyone is on the same page of needing to change things. They just don't quite know or agree on how to do it. And so what we see is that they're open to all of these ideas. Of course, they're nationalistic, if you wanted to use the term. They're patriotic. They talk about, this is our way of doing things. This is the German way. We don't like Germans. They beat their men. That's not humane. But they're very much open to the ideas. And of course, Baron Perch, who was a Prussian, basically writes the drill manual of, was it 1773? So yeah, it's not so much from England because they have zero regard for English fighting prowess. It's from Germany by and large, particularly Prussia, but also Austria. People tend to forget Austria is also kind of a leading theoretical power throughout the century.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Abel. Question for Colonel Gill. How did the Prussians and Russians learn from their experience in 1807? Cossacks and Bennigsen's army had caused Napoleon some distress in that campaign.
Yeah, that's a good question, but I think it really goes much more to 1812 than to 1807. I mean, Cossacks were not new in the Russian army, and certainly the harassment of the French rear areas and blocking communications, capturing couriers, that sort of thing was not new. I mean, famously, of course, prior to Eylau, messages to Bernadotte were intercepted and captured by Cossack patrols. But the numbers and the frequency, the ubiquity really of Cossacks, and again, not just Cossacks, but for example, the band that goes to Hamburg is about somewhere 1,200, 1,500 men. Well, that includes a large number of Cossacks, 2 or 3 cannons under a fellow named Tettenborn, but also regular Russian cavalry. I forget which dragoon regiment goes with Tettenborn Kazan dragoons, I think, but the Izum Hussars, the Finland Dragoons, etc., were parts of these groups, so not just Cossacks. Likewise, of course, the groups, the Strife Corps that go ahead of Blücher's army in April of 1813 are largely composed of regular Prussian hussars. So his son, as you know, Michael Franz, leads one of these 2 squadrons of the 1st Silesian Hussars, and often then they would attach, say, 50 or 60 Cossacks to a pair of Prussian hussar squadrons to assist them and to contribute to deception. Because of course, you show different uniforms and different people, and the reports that are going to go back to the French would seem to indicate that there's more of the enemy than there really is. So it's not just Cossacks, it's a lot of regular cavalry from both Prussians and Russians.
Okay, question for Dr. Morgan. What kind of instructions did Duhain receive from Napoleon regarding the occupation of Barcelona? Was Duhain led to believe he'd receive cooperation, or would this be a hostile takeover? How much initiative did Duhain have to take to achieve this mission? That's like 3 questions.
Yeah, there are 3 questions in that. Now, the first part, if you could repeat the first part for me.
What kind of instructions did Duhain receive from Napoleon regarding the occupation of Barcelona?
The instructions that he got, and there is in the correspondence, instructions that he should occupy. He's not given specific instructions as to the politics of it, only the military and the handling of his soldiers. He is told 2 political things. The first, that he is to get into contact with the Captain General, but he's not told what to do. He's only told to contact him and maintain contact with him. And secondly, he's told to maintain the firmest discipline. And thirdly, he's told to keep secret the actual orders to stay in Barcelona. He's instructed to tell the Captain General that they're going to be moving on any day to Cadiz, which of course they don't. Neither in the Archives Nationales nor in the published correspondence are there any specific political instructions for him. The emperor seems to have left that to Duhain's discretion. Now, the second part of that question is?
Was Duhain led to believe he'd receive cooperation, or would this be hostile takeover?
Yeah, it's definite that the emperor thought he would get cooperation. And as a matter of fact, Duhain thought this himself and got that cooperation. Captain General Espeleta was extremely cooperative all the way into the period of May. There was a point in June when Duhain demanded 400,000 francs to pay his soldiers, that is to purchase provender for his soldiers. And the regent of the Audiencia objected to it, and Duhain threatened to have him shot for it. So you only get the real hostility after after the middle of May and going into June of 1808. So they did expect cooperation and in fact got it. And the third part is,
how much initiative did Duhain have to take to achieve this mission?
the emperor gave him almost complete discretion. He was not given very detailed instructions outside of material coming out of the Ministry of War, what battalion that he was supposed to expect here, how many artillery pieces were his division supposed to have, and what was to be expected. That kind of daily military stuff, the emperor did send. But as far as the actual process of occupation, Napoleon left that entirely to him. Now, there's another character here, and that's Marshal Murat, because he was lieutenant general of for both the emperor and for the King of Spain in Madrid. He did send instructions to Duhain, but these instructions were merely a repeat of what the emperor had said. The only independent instruction that he sent to Duhain was that he should report to him regularly. And during all those months, Murat only sent 7 letters to Duhain.
Okay, we're 15 minutes over, so we'll just go with one last question. And this is for Colonel Gill. How did French garrisons in Poland affect Russian rear area security?
Yeah, there's, in short, the Russians and the Prussians as well, they solved the garrison or the danger of French fortress garrisons by largely, you have to get technical about whether they were sieges or blockades or observation. In most cases, not sieges, but by merely blockading the French fortress or French-held fortresses, so that they couldn't intervene in the Russian lines of communication or disturb Prussian mobilization or cause any other problems. Those tasks were left largely to Russian reserves, Prussian Landwehr, and other second and even third line forces that were not going to be really too suitable for employment in the front against the main French army in the first place. And the enterprising French commanders of these garrisons could conduct forays to gather livestock and fodder and whatnot and disturb their blockaders. But largely they solved this problem by encircling the fortresses with second line forces that prevent the French from interfering in any serious way.
Okay, well, thank you very much for 3 excellent papers. And I think that'll conclude our day. Alex, you want to are you out there somewhere?
And thank you, Dr. Leggiere.
Yeah, thanks, Mike.
Thank you very
Alex,
much.
back to you.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful panel. I want to remind all the attendees that we'll resume tomorrow. Check your emails. I'll send out the new link with the program. We have additional sessions, starting with a session on Italy. And of course, we have the keynotes talk by Professor Charles Stale, which promises to be very interesting. So have a wonderful evening and see you tomorrow.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alex.